And as I mentioned, I'm using 2.6.1, which I've compiled myself with scons-ssl all and installed it in this directory. And here's my config file for the first MongoDB that I'm going to start up. This will be our primary to start with, and we're going to use this to, initiate the replica set and then add new members. So, what have I done? I'm going straight to require SSL first of all. Authentication is true. This is basically a very expanded one. You may have seen a similar one earlier. And the key pieces that I've added, first of all, SSL mode is require SSL. SSL PEM key file, this is the server cert. For the cluster file, I'm going to use the server cert as well. Usually, these would not be the same thing, but it is the case that the server will actually default to using the server cert if you don't specify your cluster file. So I'm being a little bit specific here just to show you that it is an extra option. The cluster file is what the server is going to use to prove to other MongoDs and other MongoSs, if it was a sharded cluster, etc., that it is actually who it says it is. Right. So this is what it will be using in place of key file. So this line here is what replaces the old key file parameter, and this will be your X509 cert. This here is the server cert, which is then used to validate the clients and everything else. So they're two separate things, but in this case they're going to be the same. This is because I'm running in a somewhat contrived environment. Everything's on the same host. I didn't want to go creating tons and tons of certs, so that's why they're all the same. So you might be slightly different in production, but and then the SSL CA file, your certificate of authority file. This is basically what's been used to verify the server and what would be then used to verify any incoming X509 certs and or any incoming server certs for the cluster file. So very important there as well. Cluster auth mode I've set to X509. And then the rest are all pretty standard stuff. I'm just using small files, no journal, and oplog size just to save some disk space on this fairly limited VM. Now that the SSL enabled and requiring SSL instance has actually been started, and we haven't added any users to it yet, of course, it is blank. So it should be sitting there waiting for rs.initiate and then for us to actually add users, which we can do still via the localhost exception. We just have to connect with SSL first. So I'm going to connect with SSL here, and let's do that. There we go, successfully connected. And if we run rs.status, you can see we're on test server, we're on the primary, and we've got a working replica set, but of course we haven't actually added any users. Now we could add regular users here, and we could connect and authenticate with those and use a standard challenge response, users and passwords, but we have a better option now. We have the option instead to use X509 certs. So what we're going to do is add a user. It's going to look a little different than our normal users, and the reason for that is that we're going to be using this external database. We're going to run a command against it. So db.get sibling db $external, and we're going to run this command called create user. So it's not too dissimilar to creating a normal user. However, this is a very odd username, you might think. Well, this is the subject line from the cert, the X509 cert, that we're actually going to be using to authenticate. You saw me connecting with it. I just had it in the command line for the Mongo shell a little while ago. It's not actually being used, it's just signing in. It's not actively being used to authenticate in that case. So it's that same cert, and I'll show you how to extract this line. You can either just cat the whole file, scroll up and have a look at the subject line, or you can run an OpenSSL command, which is in our documentation as well for how to do this. We're going to give this user read-write access on database test and have them as a user admin any database on the admin database. And as we covered earlier on, we were talking about roles and authorization. This gives you indirect super user access. So what we'll actually do in a minute is use that to modify this user and things like that. But that's what we're doing here. Down here you can specify your right concern. I'm giving you sort of the best practices version of this, W majority with a timeout. We only have a primary, so it's going to be pretty simple to satisfy the W majority in that case. So let's do that. Okay, 1. If we go use $external show users. I can't actually do it because I don't have sufficient privileges to actually show it. However, I can alter the user. So let's do that. Let's do it so that we can actually see everything that we want to see. And for that, I'm going to do something that you should only do with great care. I am going to grant that user the root role. So if you like, I was just giving you the quick look at best practices. You should then limit the scope of the users that you're going to add from that point on and only give them the permissions that they require. But just so I don't run into any other nasty little things where I didn't give myself permission to run a particular command, I'm going to make myself a super user. So, and I failed on this one as well. Actually, I know why that is. It's because I haven't actually authenticated. So let me authenticate first. So I'm going to use the same get sibling DB call, external. I'm going to auth against it. I'm going to use the mechanism MongoDB-X509. And the user is that same user that I added earlier on. Now the fact that I've already connected with this shell using the correct client cert means I don't have to disconnect, reconnect, and specify that cert. So this is a handy little shortcut here. So I've authenticated as that user, and I should now be able to alter the user. Now, if everything has gone to plan, my previous test should now work. Use external, show users, there we go. So now that after you've authenticated and updated the user, we can switch to external and run the show users command. And here you can see it, external dot, and then here's our username. That's the ID it's given, and then the user itself. So there's the roles, and as you can see, I now have the super user root role against the admin database. So essentially have the root role globally at this point. So let's break out of this, and I've created a couple of other very, very similar config files. So let's have a quick look at those. This is going to be another instance that I run on 27020, hence the numbers. And again, very similar. I just have a commented out line from a legacy. This is one of the 2.4 options that's no longer used. All the rest of the thing should look very, very similar here. So it's really just the ports and the paths that have been changed from the primary. So we started our first secondary. Let's start the second one. Let's go back, and once again, we're going to connect with SSL and use our client cert. This is our X509 cert that we mentioned earlier on. We're going to connect with that. We haven't authenticated yet. We logged out and logged back in, so we're not authenticated yet, so we don't have the permissions to see the startup warnings. We're not currently logged in as a user. So let's quickly log in again using our same command from before. There we go. Our status, as you can see, is still the same as it was previously. No big changes there. Let's add this node. So let's add our two new nodes. Test server 27020. Let's add that one. That's okay. Let's add 27022. That's okay as well. They're in startup 2 at the moment. That should alter very, very soon. They should be in secondary momentarily. There's no actual data on these hosts. So, yep, there we go. They've both transitioned to secondary now. And essentially what we have now is these two new ones are authenticating as __ system and using their server certificates, their cluster files, but the same certificate as the server because we didn't specify a different one, using their server certs to authenticate with each other and no longer using a key file. The benefit, again, as I mentioned, is that they can be validated and revoked as needed. We have support for certificate revocation lists, or CRLs. So a much more secure setup now. The communication between these hosts will be SSL encrypted, and as we mentioned earlier, also compressed. So you can't sniff it, you can't see it on like a TCP dump or a packet capture unless you happen to have the certs to allow you to decode it, of course. And an overall much more robust, from a security perspective, configuration. Now the one last thing I mentioned I was going to do was show you how to determine what the subject line was of a particular cert. So we're going to do it with the client cert that we were using when we were connecting with the shell. And this command is, you can get it from the OpenSSL man pages, obviously, but it's also included in our own documentation as part of the tutorial to configure X509. So this is included there. Let's take a quick look at the output. And I'm just going to pipe this into head so I'm not printing out the whole cert that we're using here just in case that it gets reused. It's only for QA purposes, so it shouldn't really matter, but just security best practice, I'm just going to pipe it into head-5 so only the top is seen. It's the only part that you actually need. So you get the subject line here. CN is test client, and the OU is QA client, O is MongoDB, ST is California, C is US. Let's do the same thing for the server one that we just used, or we just used for as the cluster file. And you can see the CN is changed, test server instead of test client, right? The organizational unit is QA instead of QA client, and the rest is the same. So when the servers are checking to see whether this is a valid user and a valid cert to be using for X509 authentication for the internal system processes, they're going to compare this whole subject line here. And if they're equivalent, then they'll accept it. You'll use X509 certification, and off you go. On this side, for the client end of things, the CN is expected to be able to change. Right, so the changes is your host name is going to change quite a bit. For the test server, you need to have more of this the same. Again, all of this is documented pretty well in the tutorial. It lays out exactly what needs to be comparable in the certs.